In the jungle, the worst enemy isn't always the man with the rifle. Sometimes it's the ground, the heat, the rot, the insects, and the feeling that something is watching you, even when you can't see it. Because in the Pacific, you didn't fight on open fields. You fought in green walls, visibility measured in meters. And every step forward felt like stepping into a mouth. That's why booby traps were everywhere, not just mines, not just grenades, but anything that could turn a path into panic. And in that kind of war, one soldier found a way to use the jungle itself as a weapon, not with steel, not with explosives, but with something alive. Snakes. This is the story of the soldier who used snakes as booby traps, and why, in jungle warfare, fear could be just as deadly as bullets. This wasn't an official tactic. It was a field improvisation, passed between soldiers, not written in manuals. By 1943 and 1944, the jungle had its own rules. You couldn't dig proper trenches the way you could in Europe. The ground was wet and stubborn, foxholes filled with water, gear rusted overnight, food went bad, bandages grew mold, and your uniform never truly dried. Every patrol was slow, cautious, and exhausted. You didn't march. You pushed through vines, mud, and roots, and you did it while listening for sounds that weren't supposed to be there. A snapped twig, a breath, a whisper, because the enemy didn't need to defeat you in a big battle. In the jungle, they could bleed you one man at a time. One ambush, one raid, one knife in the dark, and sometimes one trap. Booby traps in the Pacific weren't just extra danger. They were strategy. They forced patrols to move slower. They broke formations. They created noise. And noise in the jungle was death. A single trip wire could turn disciplined soldiers into a cluster of shouting men. A single grenade trap could stop an entire advance for an hour. And when a unit stopped moving in the jungle, it became a target. But here's the problem. By the middle of the war, soldiers learned to look for traps. They watched the ground. They watched branches. They watched anything that looked too clean, too straight, too deliberate. The jungle was chaos, so anything that looked organized was suspicious. That made traditional booby traps harder to use. Tripwires were spotted, grenade pins were checked, suspicious logs were avoided. So the men who survived weren't just brave, they were creative. They learned how to hide danger inside normal jungle life. And that's where the snake trap comes in. Because a snake doesn't look like a weapon. It looks like the jungle being the jungle. The soldier who first tried it wasn't a madman. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He wasn't trying to create some horror story. He was trying to solve a problem. His position was being probed at night, not full attacks, just small patrols, scouts, raiders, men who moved like ghosts. They would creep close, listen, test the wire, look for weaknesses, and then disappear. But every time they came close, the defenders had the same issue. You couldn't see them clearly, you couldn't always shoot, and if you fired too early, you gave away your exact position. So you waited, and waiting in the jungle at night felt like being hunted. The soldier wanted an early warning system, something that would trigger a reaction, something that would break stealth, something that would force the enemy to make noise. Because noise meant a target. Noise meant movement. Noise meant the jungle finally gave you something to shoot at. He didn't have unlimited supplies. He didn't have mines to waste. He didn't have fancy alarms. What he had was rope, scrap cloth, empty ration tins, and the jungle. And in the jungle, snakes were everywhere, in trees, in water, in the grass. coiled in the shade like living wire. Most soldiers didn't want anything to do with them, because you didn't need another thing trying to kill you. But this soldier understood something simple. Fear works faster than logic. A man can control himself when he hears a gunshot, but when something drops onto him in the dark, something cold and alive, his body reacts before his brain does. He flinches, he shouts, he moves, and in the jungle, that's all you need. A second of panic, a burst of noise, a broken formation. The trap was crude. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't elegant. It was just a container. Sometimes a sack, sometimes a box. Sometimes a length of bamboo sealed at one end, something light enough to hang, but strong enough to hold a moving animal for a short time. He placed it low over a narrow path, a path the enemy would likely use, not the obvious trail, the side routes, the little gaps between thick vegetation, the places scouts used because they thought they were being clever. Then he tied a thin line across the path. A trip line? But unlike normal traps, the trip line didn't pull a grenade pin. It didn't detonate anything. It simply released the container. A simple drop mechanism, and when a man hit that line, the container fell, and whatever was inside fell with it. Now, it's important to understand what this did. It wasn't designed to kill by venom. That's the movie version. That's the viral story version. In reality, the snake was the alarm, the panic device, the noisemaker, the chaos trigger. Because even if the snake wasn't deadly, even if it didn't bite, the enemy didn't know that in the dark. All they knew was something alive just hit them, something moving, something that could be poisonous, something that could be anywhere on their body. And suddenly, the stealth patrol wasn't stealth anymore. It was men slapping at their uniforms, stumbling backward, whispering, turning into shouting. A quiet jungle turning into movement. And movement meant the defenders finally had what they needed. A target? The first time it worked, it didn't look heroic. It looked messy. A scout hit the line. The container dropped. The jungle erupted with a sudden burst of noise. A voice, sharp, surprised, involuntary. Then scrambling. Then the sound of someone moving too fast through brush. That's when the defenders opened fire. Not blindly, not spraying. Controlled bursts toward the movement, toward the shapes, toward the sound. The patrol didn't attack. It didn't charge. It withdrew. Because their advantage was stealth, and stealth had been taken from them. The trap did its job. It didn't win the war. It didn't rack up impossible numbers. It created a moment of control in a place where control didn't exist. After that, the idea spread the way all battlefield ideas spread. Quietly, not through paperwork, not through officers, through whispers, through men sharing what worked. A soldier would say, "Don't hang a grenade, hang something worse." And the other man would laugh. Until he understood. In the jungle, the enemy expected wire. They expected metal. They expected explosives. But they didn't expect the jungle to attack them on purpose, and that uncertainty did something powerful. It made them hesitate. It made them slower. It made them nervous. And nervous men make mistakes. They step on branches. They breathe too loud. They freeze when they should move, or they move when they should freeze. Fear doesn't just scare people. It changes how they behave. And in a war where seconds mattered, that was enough. But there was another reason the snake trap worked. It was cheap. A grenade was valuable. A mine was valuable. Supplies were limited, especially in forward jungle positions. You couldn't waste explosives on every path. But rope, scrap cloth, a box, that was everywhere. It didn't cost ammunition. It didn't reveal your position with a blast. It didn't require perfect timing. It just sat there quietly, waiting, and when it triggered, it didn't destroy the jungle. It blended into it. After the noise, after the chaos, after the withdrawal, the jungle returned to silence, and the defenders reset it again and again and again, a simple system that kept buying them seconds. Seconds to wake up, seconds to aim, seconds to survive. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Nothing in jungle war was. Sometimes the snake escaped early. Sometimes the trap was triggered by an animal. Sometimes the rain ruined the setup. Sometimes the enemy learned to avoid that path entirely. But that was still a win, because the goal wasn't just to hurt the enemy. The goal was to shape their movement, to control where they went, to force them into open ground, to force them away from weak points, to make them predictable. In the jungle, predictability was power. And if the enemy was predictable, they were vulnerable. The soldier never got credit for it. There was no official record that said, "Snake booby trap effective." No medal, no ceremony, no story told back home. Because war doesn't reward creativity on paper. It rewards results. And the result was simple. His position stopped getting probed so easily. The night raids became less confident. The enemy approached slower, wider, more cautious. And that meant fewer men died in their sleep. Fewer sentries were taken quietly. Fewer patrols walked into the dark without fear. Because the jungle had become hostile in a new way. Not just naturally, but deliberately. And that's the real lesson of this story. The most dangerous weapon in the jungle wasn't always a gun. It was uncertainty. It was fear. It was the idea that the ground itself could betray you, that the vines could hide something living, that the darkness wasn't just empty space, but a place where anything could happen. The snake trap didn't win battles with venom. It won with panic. It broke stealth. It created noise. It forced mistakes. And in the jungle, mistakes were fatal. So when people talk about World War II, they talk about tanks. They talk about battleships. They talk about famous generals and giant offensives. But the jungle war was different. It was small, close, personal. A war where survival often depended on whatever you could build with your hands, whatever you could find around you, whatever you could turn into an advantage, even something alive, even something terrifying, even something as simple as a snake. Because in the jungle, you didn't just fight the enemy, you fought the environment, and sometimes the only way to survive was to make the environment fight for you. If you want more forgotten front stories like this, real survival tactics, field improvisations, and the brutal reality of war, subscribe. Because the war wasn't won by perfect plans. It was won by people who adapted first and lived long enough to tell nobody about it.